Okay. Okay, so yes, as I was saying, welcome everyone to the Childhood and Society seminar series, which this is the third or fourth in this year's round, and it's been running for 5 years now, and the intention of the series is to provide a safe space where we can share our research, our Middlesex Education Department research, to our peers and to a wider audience. And we have all sorts of research presented throughout the seminar series, from big funded project research to PhD research to everything in between. So works in progress, research ideas, you know, the full gamut. So you get really nice wide range of research projects and initiatives from across the Middlesex Education Department. And yeah, so this year we have 14 seminars, and as I say, I think we're on to our fourth, and the intention is to showcase a wide range of theorists and philosophers, and to also present a range of pedagogies and practices and research innovations. And what I think it's fair to say unites us at Middlesex is a concern to offer a critical engagement and the pursuit of social justice through our research. So today I'm delighted to have Angela Scollan present her work with us. She will tell you more about precisely what the research is, but I understand she's speaking on behalf of others, a wider team, and really about pedagogical innovation. So I'm not going to take up any time. As I said, if you could just do the courtesy of keeping yourself on mute whilst Angela is presenting, that would be great. And just remember to populate chat with any questions, comments you have as you go along. So Angela will speak for 20-25 minutes, and then we will have sufficient time for question, answers, discussion at the end. So over to you, Angela.
Oh, thanks so much, Jane. Thanks everybody for joining the session. So again, it's the session is really based on pedagogy, being and working with children and for children, really built on rights-based philosophy and approach, and also kind of really coming from early childhood education approach as well. So it's focusing on shaping curricula through pedagogical innovation, and facilitation of young children's narratives in the classroom. So that's the focus. And I've kind of used this picture as a metaphor of all the connections that happen when you begin dialogue, when you're dialoguing with children, you know, which way can it go, what happens and what gets discussed and who connects with who. I really like this kind of picture as a metaphor for facilitation. So the presentation discusses data from workshops in classrooms in 2 schools in London, and the data today is going to be really focusing on 7 to 8-year-old. So the workshops were inspired by methodology used in a series of projects that I've been involved in. The research I'm presenting today is only a snippet of my findings, and working with facilitation, I probably didn't realise how generous it was. It's giving so much, and there's so many findings from it in so many different kind of areas to consider, that you know there's just one bit to look at today. So today's presentation will concern the promotion of children's narratives as a possible way to promote dialogue, so dialogic pedagogy. However, in my professional experience of working and researching directly with children, I've worked passionately to promote dialogue in so many kind of different contexts, using an array of resources and activities and visual materials. So I'm really well aware that there are lots of different ways to promote children's voices and their participation. So I'm just showing one example here. So the design of the workshops connected to the aim of my research, which was 1, to involve activities to support children's collection and production of visual materials relating to their memories, and secondly were to bring in activities that were undertaken to facilitate dialogic exchange around personal stories based on equality and empathy and expectations of personal expressions with children. The workshops and facilitation of dialogue were led by myself. I'm a professional educator and I've trained in the practice of dialogic pedagogy and facilitation. It's been something I've been doing for quite a lot of years, and really kind of works on Bamberg's narrative practice and identity navigation. And there's some pictures involved there. They're kind of really kind of pixeled out in a way that the school and the children and the parents enabled me to be able to use some of the pictures that they agreed that we could. And it was just to show sort of some of the environments of where facilitation was happening. And something that I won't go into now, but as facilitation happens, it kind of unfolds. And when you begin to bring facilitation into an environment, particularly in a school, perhaps with 7 to 8 year olds, it's a kind of a new way to work with children. So you're entering their spaces and their environments where maybe more traditional routines and approaches were used. So when you bring facilitation in, more sessions you do, the more facilitation kind of changes and morphs into lots of different things. I can't say any more about that now because it's another presentation, but so I'll just move forward now. So visual materials and facilitation. So visual materials were used during workshop activities because photographs and artifacts are resources that children were asked to bring in that they chose to if they wanted to. And these resources, they break down the classroom walls because they travel across time and space and experiences. And these children chose to bring in particular precious photographs or artifacts that they wanted to share. So facilitation was used as a methodology for the development of innovative pedagogy based on children's agentic participation to learning. Secondly, the promotion of dialogue as the form of children and adults' participation to learning. So this means that facilitation was used to engage in dialogue that was a two-way, and it wasn't predetermined. We didn't quite know, when we started on this journey, what was going to be discussed. It was quite unknown, which of course is exciting, whilst also gives you quite a lot to reflect on. This is a picture that was shared by one child who was really bringing in a story about puddles and experiences, but you never know where these stories and experiences will go to, and the memories that are shared from the children, they go global and they go across time and experiences. So again, something else to consider for future presentation. So in my praxis, I always plan and design an evaluation of the intervention that I'm using, which is linked to the professional culture that I'm part of, where reflection and reflexivity are vital for the work that we do. So now I discuss how the workshops were evaluated. I evaluated facilitated activities in the workshop, focusing on the impact of facilitation regarding the development of dialogue. And this was based on a series of qualitative indicators, but the main indicator focused on children's choice to access the role of authors of their own stories and narratives. So it's all about choice, children choosing to be part of the facilitation and choosing to lead or share their narratives. So choices that, one, are not conditioned by the choices of others, and point two, choices that are consequential. So consequential meaning that they make a difference for the participants who are joining in with those interactions. So this equals a signal and a situation of agency, which this really builds on Baraldi and Tom Coburn's work for theorising childhood, Oswell and Leonard's work, Madeline Leonard's work as well, where they talk about agency within the context of a particular environment and how that's supported. So an aspect of facilitation that was successful in the promotion of children's narratives within the classroom related to facilitators' comments on narratives. So there are many strategies and types of facilitation that can happen in classroom. So facilitation is made up, for instance, of asking questions, of offering feedback, using continuous to keep communication or stories going, using repetition to support children, using acknowledgement tokens to show that what they're saying is really appreciated, and you're understanding what's being said. You might be using a formulation that might check the gist of what's being said. or using utterances to show that you're listening, to sort of support children to carry on. So there's lots of tools and strategies within the umbrella of facilitation. But today I'm going to share with you personal stories. And I'm sharing them because I didn't really expect that to be to have such an impact. And personal stories came out through analysis of the data. So the discussion will concern examples of how personal stories promoted children's agentic participation as authors and as co-authors and as commentators of their own narratives. So that we'll look at here. So in the context of the research, facilitation was used as a methodology to create favourable conditions of children's agency. Children's agency, for instance, can be observed when children access the role of authors during the workshops. This became quite exciting. Children chose to take part and they chose to lead, they chose to join in, they chose to interact with each other and create some amazing narratives and stories. So let's explore what facilitation is. It's a form of communication enhanced by chains of 1, adult actions that enhance children's production of knowledge and choices, and 2, children's actions that display their production of knowledge and their choices. So therefore productions and display of choices are valued, particularly during facilitation and personal stories, because they are based on the knowledge and the knowledge that connotes conditions of agency. Authorship of narratives of children's stories is agency when based on children's choices that can make a difference in the context of their experiences. So there is consequential and it is consequential and is an impact as well. And this kind of really works on Hendry's building and restoring respectful relationships in schools, and also works on Farini's concept of trust, because there's lots of trust that comes into play when you're sharing facilitation and personal stories and narratives. So the research was based on the idea that agency can be displayed by children's choice to access their own rights and responsibilities when they're constructing their own knowledge, and they're viewed as individuals who are able to do this. So rights and responsibilities to construct knowledge can be conceptualized as epistemic authority. So when children's narratives make a difference for all participants in that context, then the choices that they choose to make impacts on others and supports others to contribute and participate should they want to. And obviously those that don't participate and don't choose to, that's their agentic choice as well. So here we consider the narratives, what narratives are. What are narratives? Well, they're children's stories. They're the stories that children want to share. They're the stories that they own. So narratives are in relation to this research. They're when there's authorship of narratives that can be the context of children's agency. So narratives are produced in all communication processes, and communication processes can be seen as the expansion and exchange of narratives. So where narratives are moving forward, backwards, up and down, kind of like the picture that we began at the beginning of the presentation. Narratives can be conceived as social constructions through which individuals interpret and they story their experiences. They're being creative, expressive, and sometimes their stories and their narratives can be quite extraordinary. And it's quite interesting. Again, it's something else that I'm not going to bring up here, but something that happened, that adult reactions to children's extraordinary narratives can be responded to in particular ways, particularly in school environment, where it's seen as something not to be celebrated. And that was something that I found really interesting. That's kind of parked to the side at the moment. But yeah, so narratives can be produced face-to-face, through face-to-face interactions, shaped by the management and the rights to access the role to be the author of your own narrative. Based on this theoretical construct, this presentation explores how personal stories facilitate children's authorship of narratives. And that kind of really works on the work of Corrie, who talks about the emotional intelligence within spaces that children use and their emotional literacy to share, to create. Works on Dunn, teaching the civil rights era students' active approach to sharing their own story. Works on Fisher and Norrick as well. There's references there to at the end. So the interactive production of narratives entail the possibility for any narrative to be reacted to and responded to. So producing then interlaced stories. So an interlaced story is where a child might share a particular experience and story, and other children then might want to link to it, or adults actually will link to it, and vice versa. So stories that start off being authored by one actually can become owned and authored by many. So we've got interlacements happening here, which are quite exciting, and again, really knock down the walls of the classroom environments. So facilitators' comments on children's narratives are responsive narratives, therefore an interpretive space where new stories can be interlaced and ongoing and really creative and quite exciting, and noisy spaces and places. A type of facilitator comments, which are personal stories, they consist in narratives that display the facilitator's closeness to children, as well as their interest in children's narratives. So when you're facilitating and you're using personal stories, your personal stories are a form, not only as a way to throw out a net to encourage those that maybe don't want to take a risk to share something, but it's also a way to show your closeness. And also, if a facilitator brings in a personal story, then they are also showing children and indicating to children that they're using their own personal memories to build on what children have said. So really appreciating and understanding and showing equality in dialogue here. So personal stories display that facilitators are willing to exchange the role of a teller and a listener with children. Children are therefore invited to position facilitators as equal participants who choose personal expression rather than role performances. And this is a real major part of facilitation, that it isn't so much of a role performance, it's more of an expression, personal expressions, and communicated and dialoguing with each other. So the data consists of 8 video recorded workshops with approximately 8 hours of facilitated interactions. And the excerpts in this presentation concern year 3, and they were selected because of the personal stories with regards to the enhancement of children's narrative, which that are the context showing and capturing children's agency because of their choices to share and to lead on their narratives. The analysis of data was influenced by conversation analysis. Conversation analysis examines how participants construct the meaning of their encounters, sequences of turns of talk as they respond to each other during conversations. However, in my research, the analysis of data goes a little bit beyond conversational analysis interest, because I'm really looking at the turns and the sequences of turns. So in my research, the analysis concerns how facilitation creates context for children's agentic authorship of narratives. So really looking at the facilitator's personal stories, where there's an example of kind of turn taking and an example of who's linking to who. So it was more about the turns than the conversation analysis per se. So the conversation analysis becomes action and reaction and action. So I began to look at the chains of talk, the sequences, so and how they were created. And again, that kind of builds on Heritage's conversational analysis and social theory work. So I'm going to just share, if I've got time, I haven't squashed through there so quickly, but I'm going to get to some of the analysis here from communications and the interactions and the choices that children shared. So I've kind of got in red here the points that I'm going to really focus on in here. So these are just some examples from interactions that happen through facilitation and through personal stories. So just to remind us that the personal stories are when children share maybe they begin to share a memory from the photograph that they've brought in or from the artifact that they've brought in, but they're really interested in talking about something from that picture. And a lot of the time, actually, the pictures that were shared, the story that the narrative that came from it, you wouldn't ever have thought that about the picture. So that's why we brought in at the beginning here about the dimensions that are travelled across the globe and across time from children's pictures and photos. So looking here in turn 4, I just want to show you here and share with you that the facilitator commented on the child's M3, by the way, here is a male, and this is just turn 3. So if you see an F or an M, it just means female or male, or FAC means facilitator. So in male 3 here, the child, he says, I've got a memory that he wants to share. And this memory came from another child's photograph that he wanted to kind of share with everybody. But what I'm going to bring you to is in turn 4 here, you can see that the facilitator says, oh, do you know what? You really remind me. So what's happening is the personal story and the narrative that the child has shared in turn 1 has been listened to, it's been interacted with. But in turn 4, the facilitator is acknowledging that there's a consequence to that child who led and who narrated and who chose to share a story and to take part. The facilitator has acknowledged and has kind of responded to that. So there's a real consequence to the child's choice. So when it's consequential like that, it makes a difference for all participants in the social content. So this is where we've got consequentiality of an action from M3's choice to share in turn 1. And then we've got the consequentiality of the responses that happened. And this really is agency captured through research. So it's the social context, and it is the interaction where each action becomes the context of the next one. So we've got loads of intersecting, you know, in the macro context, and the social roles are all impacted on in the context, but we're really looking at the turns here and how each impacts on the other. And just looking at this kind of turn of talks and sharing narratives here, in turn 6, the facilitator shares a personal story related to her memory of a seaside trip, and emphasises a lot of the context of some of the stories that children had already shared. And she was kind of, that was me, sorry, this was my story actually. These children talked about memories, and because I was linking with them, I was facilitating, they provoked me to share something that I hadn't intended to share. So it shows you the power of narrations, and it captures the power of the agency of the children and how it impacts on the facilitator. So facilitation is like a dance, it's a creative movement. Facilitation can only work with the involvement of everybody equally, this dialogue of sharing and moving and getting to know each other and appreciating each other's knowledge. So it's quite a powerful point there, that facilitation really does depend on the context and those involved and the participation. So in turn 7, we can see that the facilitator's personal story as a comment regarding M3's story. It also promotes another child, M4, who's another male, to now want to share his story. So M4 begins to access as the narrator. He wants to be an author. He chooses to join in. He offers to the child, just like this is joining into us now. There's a bit of interlacement going on. It offers to the child the possibility to interlace a narrative to the facilitator's reference with risky behaviours. So there's a risky behaviour from the dog. Thank you, whoever's sharing their dog there. In turn 7, the opening of the turn, when there's the beginning, it says and it displays continuity of the facilitator's narrative and signals an interlacement between M3, the facilitator, and M4. So there's real lacements of stories here emerging, continuing dialogue. So it's really evident there that that's a successful facilitation. The sequence of new stories interlaced with the ongoing is an example of agency, because the production of stories is based on choices, and each story makes a difference for the course of the next interaction. So excerpt 1 is an example of throwing out the net, and this is a metaphor that I've kind of constructed from this research, because I didn't realise it at the time. It's only going back looking at the videos and analysing it, that personal stories were a way to kind of combine a lot of different facilitative tools and strategies. And by throwing out a net, you offer children the possibility to use their personal stories as a pivot to continue and to share. But it's a form of facilitation based on role modelling and opening up opportunities with minimal intervention on children's contributions, and it doesn't put pressure on anybody to have to join in if they don't want to. There is another excerpt here, but I'm going to move on because of time. I don't think there's going to be enough time for it. If there is, I can go back to it afterwards. But I just want to talk about personal comments. Personal comments are also a resource to shift the topic of interaction. So when you use a personal story sometimes from the facilitator's kind of strategy, you're doing it to kind of involve everybody's stories, to involve the participations that have been, that are, and that might be. So you're throwing out a metaphor, and it's a net for non-directive invitation to contribute, opening up spaces for children's choices. So that was something that came out of this research that wasn't expected, but it was a really powerful tool within facilitation. So differently from a direct change of topic, the throwing out the net, it enables personal comments to move interactions forward while still acknowledging the validity of the ongoing narrative. So it's not cutting short children and saying, well, let's move on. It's kind of like a transition. There was lots of transitions through the metaphor of throwing out the net and through the use of personal stories. So children's contributions kept continuing to be mentioned. So it kind of really boosted self-esteem and confidence in a way for those that took risk to share and talk. So in this way, the epistemic status of the author of the ongoing narrative is preserved even when new topics are introduced. When personal comments are used to extend the area of participation, facilitators' actions in the first interactive slot after a person's story are crucially really important. So the most frequent facilitative action utilised to promote children's participation during connections were really personal stories and the form of open questions. These really came out. So I'm kind of jumping a wee bit here just because of time, and my buzzer is going to go off in about 12 seconds. So just to share and conclude here, comments on children's narratives are facilitative actions when they mark a difference from ordinary instructional activities in schools by upgrading the epistemic status of children as legitimate authors of valid knowledge. So whatever they spoke about, linked to their photographs, linked to their artifacts, the stories that they came out with, they were valid and they were seen as valid knowledge, and they were built on. Personal stories are interesting ways to facilitate children's agency as authorship of narratives by involving facilitators and children as co-tellers. So real dialogue where the co-telling is owned by, you know, everybody that's included and is part of it that chooses to be. Personal stories must be adapted to the interactive context, and they need to be connected to the children's narratives and to be respectful of children's status as primary authors of knowledge. Anything less, and it really doesn't work as well when you're considering facilitation and using it. Utilising comments as a component of a broader application of facilitative methodology can introduce equal production of knowledge as a key component to the learning experience. So the data suggests that comments can support a change in the way of acting knowledge in classrooms are interacted with. So the interactions from transmission of knowledge to co-production of knowledge. And there's a bibliography there. I think I've probably tried to cover a lot there in such a small time, but I think I'm going to probably stop there. So just to show that personal stories weren't kind of planned at the beginning of the facilitative activities, but they happened because of how they evolved with children. So, and throwing out the net, that metaphor, that happened because of children and with children, although it's kind of used as another tool for facilitation that wasn't expected at the beginning of this journey. So personal stories were really a powerful tool in using facilitation to support children's choice and therefore their agency, and their agency, when they did share stories, kind of had a real big consequence on how the rest of the facilitation and activities in the workshops unfolded. I think I'll stop there. I think that's everything.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Angela. You really crammed quite a lot in there, and the questions were flooding through. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. No, it was fabulous. But sorry about the dog. I thought it was your dog. Otherwise, I would have.
No, I don't have a dog yet.
I think your contribution from non-human. Yay. But no, it was really, really great. Thank you so much. And as I say, that there were lots of questions being posed as we went along. I just, before I open out to the floor, I just wanted to inquire about how the stories came about and the place of fantasy, because a lot of storytelling is fantastical, particularly children's, and that melding of what happens in memory in real time and what happens from the imagined and the fantastical. And was there space and opportunity for both children to generate fantastical stories and also for you to offer fantastical stories, or was it all very much a factual narrative account of life, either currently lived or memories?
Yeah, do you know what, that's a really powerful question, Jane, because what happened was we're talking about facilitation here, and it's happening in school environments, particularly when you go to work with children aged 7 to 8. Now, from early childhood education, children aged 7 to 8 are early years, but if you look at children aged 7 to 8 in school, they're not seen as early years, they're seen really, really far away, which my own research journey is really looking at the bottom-up approach and bringing in the early education into school. So it's something that I'm really passionate about, and I haven't covered that at all in this presentation, but the research was interesting. Children chose their photographs, or some of them didn't want photographs, they wanted to bring in an artifact, or they wanted to bring in anything that was their interpretation, or bringing in something that would share their memory or share something about themselves. And when facilitation first started to happen, particularly in the first workshop, the second workshop, the third workshop, facilitation began to change, and it changed the environment, because facilitation was happening in environments where children were probably interacting within a real traditional routine, traditional kind of teaching. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need that to, it's needed in school. I'm not saying anything, but I'm talking about facilitation as a way to enhance and to complement traditional teaching or progressive teaching that's happening now. But the children, when they first brought in their photographs, the first kind of workshops really were a little bit kind of, this is the picture, this is what's in it. But it was only as facilitation unfolded and there was awareness that facilitation was changing the traditional routine and responses of the roles that we learn as pupils and as teachers, that this creation started to come out. And you've really provoked me. There was one response from a teacher who stayed in the classroom, and she, at the end of it, she reflected, this child should, I can't believe she was saying that. They're complete lies, they're complete fabrications. And I kind of, responded, and I wrote it down on my reflective note, and I've gone back to that point so much. And the second point that I got, when children began to fantasize about these memories that created these worlds, and that's why I kind of started off at the beginning, that there's these realms and worlds that knock down the classroom walls and expectation and roles that we have, that these children are not pupils, these children are creators, they're writers, they're explorers, and they're coming in, and the response to the adults, so that understanding of what facilitation is and that dialogue, even though there was some teachers on board with it, and the reaction on reflection afterwards, oh, that child was really lying there, or that's not true. And I really responded to that afterwards. I really get your picture there about the creations of it, because these children were getting, I'm going to say wilder, and they were kind of going, all these stories that came out were just amazing stories. And then what happened was, then they provoked me to share a personal story, which I hadn't kind of expected to do, but the personal story was because of them and their imagination, which made me think of something. I think it was quite probably therapeutic. I thought of something when I went swimming with my dad, and he put me on his shoulders in Brighton, and because I talked about Brighton, then that erupted loads of contributions from the children. Then one of the child talked about going to McDonald's, which then created loads of other avenues for other children. So it really removed risk. Children they trusted the process of it. They kind of thought, this is okay, I can contribute here. And in the end, it became quite hard to manage because everybody wanted to participate. Their choices were to have their agency interacted with and heard. But actually then there's a problem with facilitation. How do you manage everybody's agency for this to kind of work? So then there was issues there, because we're talking about roles and responsibilities here. If you're going into facilitation and dialogue, I am a facilitator. I am a dialogic pedagogue who really, works on the critical pedagogy side of it. I really do, oppression is something that it runs through the core of what I do and stuff. So I wanted it to be different, but then there's all these ways you've got to manage it, because in my head, I was reflecting that the teachers are in the room. I can't have chaos in this room, because there's all this agency that's bursting out, that's unleashed. The teacher in me was trying to kind of keep the safeguarding aspects and not to cheese off teachers that won't let me come back for the rest of my research. The children, then, I don't want to disappoint them. So that all this thing is happening as you're calming through. And I'd love to show you some of the videos of it once they're ready, to show how it looks, because inside my head was like, as a facilitator, as a dialogue, as a teacher, safeguarding, ethics, all of these things were happening at the same time whilst I'm talking about, facilitating. So yes, Jane, just to answer your question, the dimensions that the children brought in of fantasy was outstandingly innovative, creative, and just amazing. And then they fired it off each other. It was whose cat is blacker at the end of it. They were trying to kind of really connect, and that was a really powerful part that I didn't expect. The more I did facilitation, the more I learned from that. So I hope I've answered that question.
No, that was a really comprehensive answer, and I think you may have actually answered a number of other questions that were posted in chat. But Mona was popping questions in every 30 seconds, so I think I should give you a chance to at least ask one of yours, Mona, if you'd like to ask directly.
Or just a quick practical one about the facilitation then is just the balance of sharing your own personal narratives so that you get that connection and you throw out the net. But then how do you do you have a voice that goes, oh no, now I'm taking over. Oh no, stand back a little bit, see what happens. How do you do the balance?
Yeah, no, just on one of my slides, I probably skirted over it, but you've got to be careful, because when you're facilitating and you're bringing in your personal stories, you're doing it because, look, facilitation is a form of manipulation. You are manipulating. There's lots of kind of agenda behind facilitation. It's not that it's polarized against teaching, it's just another form of communication. So when you're doing it, when you're first going into the teaching space, you can just facilitate, but you can't assume that anybody knows what you're doing, because it's new to the children. They're not used to what you're intending to bring in. So you're using lots of strategies to kind of facilitate, using open questions, using lots of repetitions and acknowledge tokens and kind of gestures that go, to show that you're listening, but you're not interrupting. But then when you do bring in your personal stories, you're doing it because maybe there's not a lot of participation at that time, because it's new and you're kind of transitioning into this kind of new arena. So you do have to be careful not to. And then you've also got to be careful not to, what's the word I'm thinking of, when you're showing appreciation to children, to say, oh, wow, that's really powerful what you said there, or yeah, I really like that, because then you've got to be careful. There's a fine line that can then go into assessing, which you're not assessing because you're not teaching anything. So you've got to really, really be mindful and reflexive, which is the point I made at the beginning about, reflecting and being reflexive and diffractive, like looking at what did I do, talking about it, what does that mean? That meant that to me, but actually, does that really mean that to the children? There's so much stuff that goes on. To be honest with you, I haven't been able to analyse all of it. I've got books down here full of reflective notes, and this is where you link into emergent listening, slow listening, and kind of, different ways of interacting. So there is, Mona, a really fine line there of not assessing children and not taking over too much, but managing it so that you're also looking at the children that aren't taking part and making sure that you're supporting their agency, so that you're showing them, come on, take a risk here, this is okay, you can, if you want to. So there's a lot to manage. It's not a Mary Poppins approach to dialogic critical pedagogy in any way. You know, there's a lot to manage there, and yeah, it's only as you, on hindsight afterwards, you see all these things really.
I'm just aware of the time, so I'm going to try and synthesize a few of the questions into one. And it really centers around this idea of the narratives that children engage in, that maybe they can sometimes fall into pleasing narratives, telling you what you want to hear, or reciprocating from the basis of the story that you've shared, that then they follow on in that line. And there's also been some questions around truth, and you know, so fantasy is one thing, but truthful accounts is another. And then the ethical dilemmas, where stories are presented, or narratives that start to emerge that do raise sort of ethical, your ethical radar is then beeping, like what's going on here, and what do you do with that? So of course, on the one hand, it's about balancing the rights and responsibility, the rights of the children to have the opportunity to narrate their stories, but then what do you do as the responsible adult in that situation? So I think that kind of synthesizes 3 or 4 questions that we've had.
Yeah, I think the working with the teachers, actually, you know, looking at a class profile before you go in, doing the groundwork is really important. Are there any children that you need to know about? Is there anything that shouldn't be spoken about? You know, you really kind of cover a lot, but you kind of instinctively know if something's going down. I mean, I've got 1 minute maybe. There was one child who seemed to have an identity of maybe always getting into trouble and being the class kind of person that was noticed for that. And when there was a story manifesting that was kind of reinforcing that role, I could see that this wasn't a way to go. So when another child interacted, I kind of did, you know, you do manipulate it a little bit. And, you know, there's an issue there with agency, because he wants to do that, but you've got the foresight to think, well, actually, you've got to be careful, because when you're doing research in schools, safeguarding is paramount. You know, ethics for my research is from the university side is paramount. So that there is a lot there, Jane. Yeah, there's a lot to manage, but the relationship with the teachers before you go in to do the research, and just knowing that there's a boundary where you want to bring out creativity, but you don't want to cause harm, I think, and respecting children as children first, not as the pupil.
Okay, I think, Lena, you had a couple of questions that you popped in chat, if you'd like to ask those.
Just, yeah, thank you, Angela. Really enjoyed listening to, and fantastic questions there. I'd love to have another hour here with us. But just about the CA, I just wondered about the use of that in terms of perhaps revealing something very hidden in the interaction, whether you could quickly summarize an example or the...
Yeah, I mean, looking at the critical analysis, I kind of wasn't focusing on the content. Other projects that I've worked on previously kind of looked at content. I was really interested in turn taking, but when I went back to look at the turn taking, it was interesting, and it links back to the question that Mona brought up earlier as well, about, you know, where do you manage about how much you interact and how do you steer it? I mean, I think that's responding to what you're asking, Lena, about, and that came out from that. It was looking at, do you dominate too much? Whose turns is it? How do you manage the turns? And it goes back to a point that I think Jane mentioned earlier. At the beginning of the facilitation, when I began to unpick the turn taking, it was a bit mechanical. It was a bit, you know, let's share this story, right? Who's going to answer this and who's going to question that? There was a lot of mechanic kind of roboticness that, and I knew it wasn't right, and I knew it had to move where it was going, but I didn't know how it was going to go. So the children kind of evolved that. So one point that came out from analysing the turn taking more than anything else was how the more facilitation you did and everybody was involved in, the more the turns became more fluid, the transitioning changed, and it wasn't so mechanical and teachery, if that makes, I don't mean teacher is a bad way, but wasn't so adult dominated. Sorry, I'm not sure I said that correctly.
Yeah. I'll return to this maybe with you some other time, because I meant the conversation analysis and a very detailed way of analyzing human speech, meaning you might count the pauses and at what point somebody actually signals that they're going to tell a porky pie here, and a fat one for that, because they're taking time, they're pausing before they say. But I know maybe we need to leave it since the time is...
yeah, and just to respond to that, I mean, that was of interest to me, but I had to stop at some point not to analyse every single thing because it was too much. So I'm just researching like the interactions, the turn taking, and how facilitation evolved more than that. But that did play a big part on it. And I'm hoping that I can go back to the research afterwards when I finished what I need this research for, to look at that sort of thing, to develop my understanding of facilitation and children's agency much more. But it was something for the purpose of this research that I just couldn't go into all of those minute details of gestures. And also because I'm interested in agency and self-determination, it's a kind of more about the turns more than kind of those nuances, but they are important as well, of course, in that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just aware of the time. I think we could probably sit here for the rest of the afternoon, but people possibly have other things that they want to go off to, and obligations that they need to satisfy. But thank you so much, Angela. And I think there were a number of questions still in the chat that weren't posed to you, but maybe you're happy to take those by email at some later point.
Yeah, if I could save the chat even to go through them, I'd be happy to respond to them. And I'm really thankful for everybody coming to listen to the research. Thanks so much. And it's just a small bit. There's so much more that I didn't, haven't been able to share.
Yeah, it's really, really great to hear what you're doing. And I think that this seminar series does precisely that, is we get to hear from each other about the exciting stuff we're doing that we otherwise wouldn't necessarily know about. So thank you so much. It was such a fantastically interesting presentation, and really, really appreciated. So thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, bye.
I'm going to save the chat now.
Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. Okay.
Have you got the chat?
Yeah, I'm just looking at saving that, and then I can have a look at the questions. Let's have a look. Yeah, thanks for that.